Hi there, thanks for tuning in to Dukascopy TV, and this is the Dukascopy Bank Sentiment Index for May. As you know, every month the Dukascopy research team conducts a poll among 30 academic experts worldwide to find out what their short and long-term economic prospects are for Europe, North America, as well as Asia Pacific, and we provide you with the highlights of the findings. Today we are joined by Dr. Thomas Hyclak from Lehigh University, USA. Thank you, Professor, for talking to us. But now, before we address the first question, let's have a look at the mood indicator. While experts' optimism over the European economy in the foreseeable future increased to a new record high 0.58 in 2014, the long-term prospects are believed to deteriorate, as the index fell 0.05 points from the level recorded a month earlier. Professor Hyclak, following European Parliament elections in May, where Eurosceptic parties from France and Britain more than doubled their representation in the EU Parliament, how do you believe the mood in Europe will alter in the short and long term?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I think that what's happening in the index is that in the short term, there's a bit of optimism about Europe because we seem to have put behind us the fears of sovereign debt crisis and worries about the cohesion of the euro zone. And some of the countries, like the UK in particular, have had surprisingly strong growth, so that there's a bit more optimism about Europe in the short run. It's kind of interesting. There's an interesting parallel between the Tea Party and the recent elections in Europe in that I guess this is simplifying things quite a bit, but one of the issues that seems to be driving both of these movements is concerns about big government, bailouts of banks, and so forth. And yet it's possible to say that both of these programs, the TARP and the bailout in the U.S. and the bailout of governments in Europe, have been pretty successful programs. So we have a rise of a political movement on the tails of a kind of a successful intervention. But in the longer term, there are real worries about Europe. There's the political problems around Ukraine and Russia, and then the associated energy situation. There's worries about the banks who have not recapitalized to the same extent as in the U.S. And I think there's a real concern. I mean, the real long-term concern is that France and Spain and Italy, who really need to consider labor market reforms and other pro-growth reforms in a kind of cohesive manner, that these are really hard politically to pull off within each country, and that the political elections may make it difficult for them to pull it off in the long run.
Okay, next up we have the business cycle stages. More and more professors, specifically 26 respondents out of 30, start to consider that North America's economy will gather steam in the foreseeable future, even despite the fact that in May the US GDP data fell for the first time in 3 years. Professor, considering that the housing market is an integral part of the US economy, and the Fed expressed some concerns in May regarding the slowing of the real estate market, as well as it posing a risk to the economic outlook, do you believe this could stall the expansion of the U.S.?
There's concerns that the first quarter GDP numbers were really going to be heavily influenced by weather factors, and that there'll be a rebound later in the year. Having said that, housing is a concern because housing had been adding about 1/3 to 1/2 a point to real GDP growth for 6 or 7 straight quarters until the end of last year and the beginning of this year, when housing contracted and actually contributed negatively to GDP growth. But we also have some good news in the data for April. Data on building permits, the first place where we see some evidence of housing, were up 7% year over year in April. And for apartments and building permits, we're up almost 20%. So there seems to have been a big uptick in future business activity registered in April. Housing starts also increased significantly. They were up in double digits, 16% in April over the first quarter performance. So some of that is seasonal. There's a normal pickup in housing activity as warm weather comes in springtime, but perhaps this is an indication that housing may be rebounding. Longer term, I think the real worry in housing is wage growth. Wage growth has been really slow. Average rate wage growth for production workers is only 2.5% over the last year. Real wage growth, therefore, is minuscule. That's for the average. For people earning, a substantial number of people are getting wage increases lower than that. And without a substantial recovery in the labor market, we're going to see a situation continuing where really low mortgage rates are insufficient to attract people who don't see their incomes growing fast enough to afford monthly payments. So I think housing remains a worry. It's one of the reasons why, PIMCO has come up with this idea of a new neutral, that the economy is only going to grow very sluggishly in the near future. And part of the reason is we can't expect a big boom in housing. But I don't think that this is a big negative risk, at least for 2014.
And finally, when we look at the sentiment index for the 3-year term and how it has been progressing, it appears that Asia-Pacific region saw a jump in its long-term prospects to the highest level this year at 0.79. Professor, do you see the trend continuing for the area, or do you think that North America or Europe has a chance to outperform Asia-Pacific?
Well, I don't. Yeah, I'm actually very bullish on Asia-Pacific, although it's probably the case that China will continue to slow. The government seems to be committed to trying to wring out any possible real estate bubble and to slow the growth of the Chinese economy. But we're still talking about rates of growth of real output in the 5 to 7% range based upon the IMF's latest forecast. And what's happening in China with the rise in wages is some of that is contributing to a regrowth of manufacturing in North America, but some of it is also spreading to generate economic growth in places like Vietnam and the Philippines. So I think based upon the historical patterns that have been put in place, particularly in this last decade, we would have to be saying the growth in Asia would be stronger than North America and Europe. Europe is going to be dealing with, as we said before, banking issues and stuff. North America has in both North America and Europe, we have continuing negative contributions to growth coming from the government sector, so we have to generate all growth privately. And with housing issues being a concern and consumer debt in general, there's not likely to be strong growth. So I think, this is one of the best economic stories of the last 2 decades has been the fact that growth in China and India, and also Brazil and Russia, the BRICS, has managed to pull millions of people out of poverty and lowered for the first time in a long time the world level of poverty. And I see that continuing, that if the new government in India can manage to get growth restarted, although it's going to require politically sensitive reforms, and if somehow Brazil and Russia can get back on track, we might see a continuation of this really great story about poverty reduction through the growth of these countries. And I expect that to continue.
Well, that is all for today, Professor Hyclak. It was great having you on the program. And as to our viewers, you can easily find more findings on the Dukascopy Bank Sentiment Index by going to Dukascopy.com and clicking on Sentiment Index under the Market Research section. Until next time, keep watching Dukascopy TV. Goodbye.